Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our NFP National Community Session, Fit for Purpose Governance for the NFP sector. My name is David Gilchrist, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Public Value here at the University of Western Australia. I'm very pleased to say I'll be the facilitator for this session, so I'll chair this initial part and then come back at the end to say thank you to people. Before I do anything though, I'd like to just acknowledge or provide an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledging the very many First Nations people around Australia and indeed some international people attending to ensure that we acknowledge those people effectively. This session will be recorded and made available along with the slide pack to all those who have registered for the session today. For that reason, all members will be muted so that no identifiable details will be published as part of this recording. To help everyone get the most out of today's session, if you'd like to pose questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So type in your questions as they occur to you to make sure we capture them, and then we will go look at those in the Q&A period. You're also invited to participate in this session using both the comments and the Q&A functions. So comments in these functions are recorded and a useful resource for CANS in developing further events for members. However, we remind you to keep your comments respectful. You should not post anything that's defamatory, and we remind you that professional behaviour is a fundamental principle of our code of conduct. Inappropriate conduct will not be tolerated and may lead to comments being restricted or your removal from the session. Okay, so let's just go to the speakers now. We've got a great session this morning where we'll have a keynote speaker, and then we'll have comments from our two panellists and have a Q&A session, and making sure that we get you out of the session by the end of the hour. I'd like to introduce our presenters then. So today we're joined by Melissa Grove FCA from Ryan Consulting, Frances Norman from the Centre for, the Centre of Decommissioning Australia, and by Peta Wootton from Fremantle Women's Health Centre. We've also got Alina Nelson, who is the chair of our, the vice chair of our Young WACA's panel, and she will be emceeing the Q&A session when we get to that point. Just a little bit of intro. Each bio of the speakers has been promulgated as part of the material leading up to this session, but just so that you're aware, Melissa or Mel Grove is a professional with more than 19 years of financial and commercial experience, working across Big Four practice, large corporate entities and diverse geographical locations. Dr. Frances Norman is the CEO and Managing Director of the Centre of Decommissioning Australia, or CODA, an NFP working to bring together Australia's industry around the opportunities and challenges of decommissioning and end-of-life oil and gas facilities. And then finally, Peta is first reported to an NFP board when establishing a regional integrated trauma centre for women and children. A decade later, she started up the Mental Health Law Centre. So all of these speakers have great experience and great capacity to be able to inform us today about fit for purpose governance for the NFP sector. So I'll hand over to you, Mel, to get underway, please.
Good morning, good day, good afternoon to everyone, all in Australia and New Zealand. I think before I get started, I'd like to echo Dave's sentiments, and I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose lands that I come to you from today, and acknowledge the traditional elders and owners from the lands on which you join us today. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, both past, present and emerging, and also appreciate their ongoing contribution to the amazingness of our lands. For those that I haven't had the opportunity to meet as yet, my name is Mel Grove, and like David said, I have almost 20 years. The years seem to go just fly by. 20 years of financial governance and commercial experience. And that has been spent on both sides of the fence, both on boards and also in reporting through to those boards. I've spent countless hours, I can't even tell you how much, discussing fit for purpose, not-for-profit governance. Both of our esteemed panellists today, both Frances and Peta, We spent many hours, I dare say, speaking around the boardroom table and also across our dinner tables discussing what is fit for purpose governance for the not-for-profit sector. What I'd like to do for you today is really take you on a journey, set the scene of where we're at, and then lead into a really interesting discussion with our panelists and delve into the questions as to how we can continue to contribute to what can be a fit-for-purpose response to this challenge we have around not-for-profit governance. Oops, a bit excited there. So where are we today? Do you know, like I was doing the research for this conversation today, and the latest report that I could find on the number of not-for-profits we have was a 2010 Productivity Commission report. And I dare say it wouldn't have changed too much over the past decade or so. But 600,000 not-for-profits are registered in Australia, contributing to $43 billion of Australia's GDP. Let's just take a minute to consider that. $43 billion of our Australian economy is contributed by not-for-profits. Approximately 10% of those, around 60,000, are charities which are registered and have oversight by the ACNC. And then another third of those, all the calculations today for the CAs out there, and approximately a third of those have deductible gift recipient status with the ATO. In that not-for-profit sector, we have 4.6 million volunteers with a wage equivalent of approximately $15 billion. From other research I had, it looks like that number's actually ballooned up to more than 6 million volunteers as of a couple of years ago. 6 million people who are giving up their time. That is the not-for-profit landscape that we're actually operating in. So one could say, for that level of dollar impact, it really does make sense that there's an appropriate level of governance. Albeit, is it appropriate given that we have volunteers? Are they actually equipped, these boards and management, to carry out the fiduciary and legal duties associated with actually steering the boat of $43 billion of Australians' GDP? I'd like to now, that's actually a great segue into the governance. If we have a look and contrast the governance associated and the oversight structures associated with the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector, it really is interesting. In the for-profit corporation sector, there's one very clear oversight body. That's the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. ASIC is very clear. They do all the regulatory governance and compliance requirements for for-profit organisations, which is very fit for purpose. People want to know what's happening with their money and to make sure that it's being accounted for in an appropriate manner. If we contrast over to the right-hand side for the not-for-profit industry, so I'm just going to keep reminding you here, the $43 billion industry, 4 to 6 million volunteers, lots of charities in there, all set up for a cause. These organisations are, depending on structure, regulated by also ASIC. So if you have a not-for-profit such as CODA that's set up as a company limited by guarantee, you win. What is that? You get first prize. You get to be regulated, just like our colleagues over in the for-profit sector, by the Corporations Act. You fall into all the requirements that are needed for policies, procedures, and the like. For those charities, the 60,000 charities we refer to, then we have the ACNC. So the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, they have oversight and regulation of those particular charitable organisations. The ATO has oversight over the deductible gift recipient status. So like we said, about a third of those ACNC charities also have deductible gift recipient status, which gives you another layer of reporting and regulatory requirements. What about for those organisations like Fremantle Women's Health Centre or other small community groups? We have an absolute plethora of unincorporated and incorporated associations, which are actually bound by the Associations Act. There are so many more regulatory requirements that we need. How do we make sure that our voluntary / unpaid directors are actually well equipped to be able to respond to these challenges? One of my very esteemed mentors, colleagues, and also a lecturer, Dee Rose, she spoke about our directors moving away from being called a volunteer director or a volunteer member and actually changing the language to paid or unpaid, and really to emphasize that the responsibilities that we have may be the same depending on structure, regardless of whether we are paid or not. Really quite sobering information that we need to continue to consider. Continuing on with my earlier thought, are our NFP directors actually sufficiently equipped for their roles? This continually comes to me as on the boards that I've been on, you look to the left and you look to the right and you hope that your board members, your fellow board members understand that you're all jointly and severally liable. So I went out there and did a bit of research. I thought, let's have a look at the popular media and see what does the media, and also what does, for my academic colleagues out there, what does the literature say about NFP directors? So last year, the Financial Review had an article talking about how the 22 reporting season was going to be the most challenging for NFP directors. So you see so many issues around income recognition, new accounting standards required and simplified disclosures, changes to the ACNC regulations, just some of the complex regulatory issues that our NFP directors and boards are required to actually deal with. I'll skip aside to the right-hand side there with Social Ventures Australia, like really talking about what are the different and complex challenges that our not-for-profit boards actually have to deal with. What do we have? Do you know, like comparably from a for-profit or corporate organisation, our not-for-profits typically have small organisational structures. The teams that are really there to emphasise for a purpose. What are they trying to do? They're trying to actually, get to the heart of what they're doing. And I use CODA and Fremantle Women Health Centre as examples that we have because we have our esteemed CEOs here with us today. But for CODA, the heart of it is getting together an independent body to bring together decommissioning structures in oil and gas, decommissioning opportunities. For Fremantle Women's Health, looking at the health opportunities available and responses for multicultural women. That is the heart of what those organisations are set up for. So our boards that address these organisations need to be very well versed and also ready to roll up their sleeves, be able to put in some hard yakka to help these organisations go forward. Last but not least is looking at my academic colleagues is that we have Jean, I think it might be Jean or Jeanne de Coker. She had a paper on actually regulating volunteer directors' duties and posing a lot of really interesting questions. Is that should volunteer / unpaid directors and paid directors be subject to the same regulatory and compliance requirements? Also, does imposing these requirements on our not-for-profit sector and our not-for-profit board members, is there some unintended consequences that we may face in the future due to imposing these same legal and regulatory duties on our NFP directors? I'm not sure. And I think coming back to that $43 billion market again, we really have to ask the question, how do we contribute to this being better? Given that this is a Chartered Accountant Australia and New Zealand event, I thought I have to spruik how we as Chartered Accountants can add value and enhance knowledge to these boards. But don't worry, this is not an advertisement, but more to reflect on, how we can actually sort of change the trajectory of some of these boards and enhance their organisational knowledge. So as Chartered Accountants, we have that financial and commercial acumen across a broad range of organisations. And as you can see on the slide here, do you know in Australia and New Zealand, we have more than 130,000 chartered accountants. We have a global alliance of more than 1.8 million chartered accountants. We really can, for those of us old enough in the room, we can really use a lifeline and call a friend, do you know? So if we have any questions or queries, we know how to find the answers. And I think that really comes back to, besides being difference makers, I think we are really question askers and solution finders. I don't think any of us expects anyone to have only the one question, the one answer, or to all the questions. There's no expert that knows everything. So I think it's really important as governance specialists to be able to know when to ask the questions, and do you know also when to admit, oh, we don't know and we need to go and find the answers. A strict professional ethics and standards that we must adhere to. I think over and above, hand on heart, there have been many occasions where I've too had to consider, if things don't change here, do we continue as we are, or do I need to step back for my own ethical standards and codes? And that's the value of having a CA on board, because you do know that, do you know, if I was a director on a board and my fellow director said I have to step off because I don't think there's sufficient governance or there should be more governance, it's something that I would really take very seriously. And last but not least, I think as being a chartered accountant, the continual learning and growth, besides the last minute ethics that some of us may do close to the 30th of June, but inculcated in us is that real continual learning and development as part of our qualification. Like always knowing that, you know, there is sort of no train station at the end of the journey. It's more like the train track that keeps going around and around and around, continual growth and development. So those are chartered accountants that can really, do you know, how do we add value to these different boards? So going back to the, you know, where do we go from here? And this is the inevitable question, and I hope no one came here today with an answer, expecting an answer from the panel, but really to spark the question of what is fit for purpose governance in the not-for-profit sector? How do we keep these conversations going? How do we continue to lobby appropriate groups to make sure that, do you know, voices are heard, to make sure that there's no expectation that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to governance? Every organisation like the AICD in their not-for-profit governance principles, they talked about each organisation must consider their own circumstances and really adapt to what is appropriate for their organisation. So I really hand the mantle over to you all to continue this conversation in all your groups. And I really look forward now to discussing with both Francis and with Peta how we start to change and move the needle in this specific area. Thanks for your time, and back over to you, Dave.
Thanks very much, Mel. Perfect timing and great comments. Thank you. I'll hand over to Francis now, who's going to make some comments, and then hand over to Peta. Francis.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much, David, and thanks so much for such an interesting presentation there, Mel. It's great to hear your insights and thoughts on this. I just wanted to, I guess, make a couple of reflective points from my own experience and maybe react a little bit to a couple of Mel's comments. I first got engaged with the not-for-profit sector around about 10 years ago when I was elected onto the Divisional Committee for Engineers Australia here in WA. I've got to say, I had absolutely no idea what I was letting myself in for at that point. And I think one of the big reflections I've had in certainly in the couple of years immediately following, and then over the years since, has been that in a lot of these organizations, people volunteer for passion. They don't volunteer because they have necessarily the skills or the experience to even understand what they're going into in the governance space. And for me, one of the big opportunities for a lot of organizations like Chartered Accountants, Engineers Australia, which was my own experience at that point, is to use to give the people that come with the passion the opportunities to build their skills and also to build their knowledge so that they can then thrive both within the organisation itself and then also external to that organisation, both in other not-for-profits and in for-profit organisations, and to take on some of those directors' duties with an understanding of what they are. Now, that's not an easy undertaking for a big organisation to find ways to support those sorts of developments, but I think certainly for the very large or the large enough volunteer organisations and associations, there's a real opportunity there to do that. Not necessarily sending everybody on a full 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 day training course, but really just equipping them with the skills that they need so it takes away some of the risk to the individuals and the risk to the organisation as well from having passionate but uninformed and unaware people, because that doesn't cover you if you end up making a decision which is contrary to the legislation. It's not good enough just to say, well, I didn't know that. You have a responsibility to know, and you have therefore a responsibility to be informed. But finding time and finding the opportunities to build that can be incredibly challenging for a lot of people. So that for me is one of my observations. The other one now in the organisation that I'm fortunate to be the managing director and CEO for, which is CODA, which is as Mel suggested, we're working in the decommissioning space, is just finding the time and the resources in an organisation which is often, we're not well funded. We do what we can with the money that we've got, to find the time to balance between the costs of ensuring that you have all of the right compliance in place against the time and the effort that you want to put into growing or working on the mission for your organization. So that can be really challenging, and just understanding where you sit in a hard evolving landscape around that can be really, really difficult. And it's why we need people like Mel, who is our company secretary, to make sure that as we are sort of pushing forward, we've got somebody who's there that we can rely on. That's job is essentially to manage all of that lot for us. So look, I'll shut up for now, and I'll hand over to Peta to make a few comments from her side as well.
Many thanks for the preceding speakers, and Kaya from Fremantle. I am just going to pick up a couple of points that really resonated with me. And the first one was Mel's reference to language. I've used the phrase unpaid workforce for volunteers for quite a while, because it actually reframes our obligations. So rather than seeing volunteers, which in the not-for-profit space has always been a backbone workforce, but rather than othering them, seeing the same work health and safety obligations, the same developmental opportunities, and the same responsibilities as paid workforce is really critical. And it's an anecdotal understanding, but certainly it seems to have more and more reportage, is that volunteerism has decreased since COVID, which for us, of course, is really worrying because it's such a backbone part of our unpaid workforce. It really diminishes our capacity as a sector to provide for community when part of our workforce is absent. And that even gets down to a practical example for me about, we used to have a fantastic volunteer or unpaid gardener who was part of our community here, and they've left. And so that position's been monetised. And I use that as a really small example, but that goodwill of a neighbour spoke to something about the fact that we're very community-based and we were seen as something of a community hub. The other issue that came across really clearly, I think, is the idea of collective responsibility and collective accountability. One of the things that you encounter when you work in community, I interchangeably use the word community managed organisations, fit for purpose, not for profit. So if you're in a community managed organisation, by default, again, you're place-based often, and you're very community-centric. And that idea of some interoperability between people that are both paid and unpaid in terms of paid workforce and boards, but also this idea that the community-managed organisations really have the passion and the buy-in. Usually there's some resonance for why people volunteer for organisations. So, for example, as a women's organisation, we have a buy-in for particular reasons from our board of management. But Francis's commentary around passion is often what gets people involved, both paid and unpaid. But the governance and the accountability and the vulnerability of our client communities demands that we're safe, and that is for all points of the compass. So those are some of the threads that I've picked up, and obviously the threads I pick up are my bias. But that again, it's very relevant in the sector at the moment, looking at our particular landscape post-COVID, because it's had a fundamental impact on the way that we deliver our service and the way that the infrastructure that we have. So I'm going to throw back now to David.
Thank you, Peta, and thank you, Francis, for your comments as well. I'm going to now ask Elena to start to moderate the Q&A, and we've got a couple of comments in the chat box already. But before I do, I did want to throw open to the speakers, and perhaps starting with you, Mel, just to use the chairman's prerogative, and ask a question about how might NFPs or NFP boards ensure that they are getting the right mix of director capacity, experience, etc. Do you have any thoughts for that? And perhaps Peta and Francis, you might jump in with some thoughts as well. Mel.
Thanks, Dave. And what a great question to sort of set the scene for the Q&A as well. But I do think those tried and tested methods, it sounds a little old school. People talk about a skills matrix, but really going back to understanding what's the vision, mission, purpose of this organisation, what are we trying to achieve, and then making sure that we actually have the appropriate skill set on the board to deliver that. And I saw one of the comments fly up briefly, but understandably, not everyone's an accounting, tax, governance expert, but it's always great to have one on your board to be able to CYA, cover yourself, to make sure that you have someone there that can, ask the appropriate questions. So although simple, I do think that, considering the skills matrix is really important on an ongoing basis of boards, irrespective of size. I don't know, what do you think, Francis and Peta?
I guess a couple of thoughts. Having been on sort of board nomination committee for a big volunteer organisation for a few years, we had some interesting challenges. So this was Engineers Australia. Their constitution requires that all their directors have to be engineers. So that in itself brings one challenge, because you cannot then have a lawyer or an accountant or a HR or whoever. You see a lot of discussion in the directors' media about that diversity on the boards. So we used to look really hard to find people who'd had diverse experience. We looked very hard to find people who had proper's the wrong term, sorry, who'd had previous board experience in organizations as well. And I think that really helped, that we were fortunate. We ran an annual program to identify and bring in new directors. We had generally two vacancies a year on a cycle basis. And we used to get more applicants than we had positions. Unfortunately, a lot of those applicants didn't have any of the things that we were looking for. They would be people who were passionate, but maybe didn't have the experience that we were seeking. So I think it's important to make sure the skills matrix, absolutely, that you have an appropriate skills matrix for what you need, that you somehow find a way to attract enough quality volunteers to put their hand up, or quality applicants to put their hand up. I think also it's good to have some form of mandated retirement cycle for your directors as well. just so that you can keep refreshing that skill pool and bringing in new people, always assuming that you have a large enough pool of people to draw on. And I realise that's definitely not the case for every organisation. So, yeah, a couple of thoughts from me. I'm sure Peta's got some super ideas on this one as well.
Look, I think for one thing, boards often don't spend enough time to actually understand each other as a collective process. So I'd be saying quite clearly investment in, in some language it's board retreats, and others it's kind of developmental conversations, because if boards only come together for once a month for the particularities of meeting, or if they might have working groups or subcommittees, even then of itself, that ebb and flow that you're talking about, Francis, which is welcoming on new board members, exiting board members, this kind of, it is a fluid collective, but they need to know each other well enough to know how decision making occurs within the group, that there can be some free and frank conversations, and also that some members who might contribute more within the meeting also feel empowered to have voice, and that it really is a collective process. The role of the board executive is really, or the role of the chair in particular, is first amongst equals, and really to establish equity and to have that kind of discernment process, and also a decision making, because effectively that's what boards really are doing. They're not just monitoring and keeping an eye, they're involved in the strategic direction and sustainability. For those decisions to be sound, then everyone really needs to literally show up, but also feel confident in the process. And the other thing, apart from that highly relational part of the work, is board 360s. I mean, every single staff member has an appraisal, every unpaid worker has an appraisal. I'm a great believer of boards, board 360s, because it's a fantastic feedback loop. I also think there's some key issues in there around the functional relationship, again, particularly between the chair and the CEO. It's good to get some lens from others on how that's operating. So I think those two, one's a more concrete mechanism, and the other one, I suppose, speaks to, as I said, that more relational piece of work, which is often overlooked. But in my experience, if you have a board that is fractured, it's usually quite silent in meetings, and then often the decision-making gets driven by a couple of key people just taking everyone else along with them. And, that's highly problematic, given, as we've said before, it's a collective accountability by all board members. That's me.
Thank you. Elena, did you have any questions?
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting session, and as a community board member myself, it was really interesting to see that other organizations have the same struggles. So just a quick reminder to everyone that there's a Q&A little button where you can ask your questions. We have a couple of questions from our viewers popped up. So the first one is, how much do you think there are major gaps on the boards? For example, what proportion do we think have strategy skills to support the core part of the director's role?
Perhaps I'll kick off with that, if that's all right, Elena. I think the NFP sector is so broad, do you see? And this is the biggest challenge that we have at the moment, is that you have very small incorporated or unincorporated associations, your basketball clubs, community groups. You have all the, on the other side of the spectrum, companies limited by guarantees such as Coda that have multiple, it seems like multiple reporting requirements you have to do under the Companies Act, all the different things that we need to actually, Companies Act, the Corporations Act. Do you know all the things we need to abide by? We receive government funding, so we have government regulatory reporting, and there's quite a plethora of sizes of organisations in between. So I dare say each organisation would have a different composition of board members, and thus there would be on some a bit of a gap on what their requirements are, because some of them don't know the basics of, have you read your constitution? Do you understand what your roles and responsibilities are? So whilst I do think it's a gap, there's a gap, I think it is quite diverse across the, with different corporate structures, different commercial structures as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Mel. I'm just reading the question, and yeah, I think every board will have a gap somewhere. It doesn't matter how large or small the board is. There will be a gap somewhere. If you were to look at the ideal board, it would be cast of hundreds, perhaps, in terms of experience and everything else. So you have to get the board down to a size that's manageable, that's appropriate for the organisation, and that will eventually mean you'll sacrifice some of these things along the journey. I think there's an opportunity with organisations, if you do have a large enough community that you can draw into, though, where you can have people that you can bring onto subcommittees of the boards for particular tasks, or where if an organisation is going through a particular transformation, that maybe you look to bring on a couple of new directors with specific skills in that space. But yeah, I would suggest that every board has got gaps somewhere, and strategy is all. I mean, that's not just a board gap. That's something that you see right across industry as well. There's a lot of people really good at tactical thinking, if you like, but the long-term strategic planning, the strategy implementation that you look to for a board, that's hard to find right across the community and right across pretty well every organisation and industry that we work with.
Thank you both. It's really insightful answers. So another question from one of our viewers is, as the only board member on a board with finance background, what is the best way to communicate to other board members that financial matters are collective responsibility? And clearly you can ask what others think, but it can feel like a deferral process. So how do we, as accountants and as financial professionals, really make other board members to understand that finance is collective responsibility for all the board members? Thank you.
Perhaps because I'm the only accountant here, I might answer this question. So I will defer to Francis and Peta. And Peta, particularly on the boards that we've been on together, when I have been treasurer or even not treasurer and in other roles such as chair, they do always defer. Your other board members do naturally defer to you to make sure that, the numbers are okay. But I think, talking about that collective responsibility, what I have tried to do with all boards that I'm involved with, whether on the exec side or on the board, is actually to ensure that we have some sort of, how can I say, storytelling around the numbers. So, you're just not throwing meaningless numbers. And, Francis, I'm sure this resonates with you as well, just not throwing meaningless numbers on a, spreadsheet or PowerPoint, making it look pretty. But what does that mean? And I think, for example, one that comes particularly to mind for me is like solvency resolutions for companies. Each organization needs to make sure, they remain solvent. Why would you look at that indicator on a monthly basis? So educating the board so that they know this is connected to your duties, even the movements within high-level analytical reviews. Do you want to know if revenue is the same as last year? Yes, you'd want to know to make sure you've actually got the grants you anticipated. Why didn't you get the grants you didn't expect to get? And really to stimulate some decent discussion. So working with the treasurer and the accountant is how can you get more storytelling to the board and really get them to understand how this actually involves them. And what I've seen is then people actually come back and ask questions, especially when they know they're on the hook for making those decisions. I just wanted to refer to also one of the comments that were made in the chat box about tax and DGR status. While I've got the spotlight here, I can also respond to that. I would like to emphasize that the examples I used are examples only. So the ATO has regulation over the whole of the NFP, landscape, so irrespective of whether you're a charity or not. So for example, you don't have to be a charity to actually apply for an income tax exemption. So yes, I should have put that caveat up there on the PowerPoint, but just to re-emphasize that point as well. Thanks, Olena. I don't know if Francis or Peta wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, look, just say that the value of the financially literate, which by default this collective is really around the translation role, but also importantly, I think the future proofing. So there's this kind of rear view mirror of finance, but then there's also, when you're looking at strategic planning or again strategic decision making, which is really putting some context to the numbers. And I think at the moment within the NFP sector or the community managed organisations, particularly for smaller ones, which is certainly where I locate myself, there's such thin margins that conversations that are financially literate at a board and at a staffing level are more important than ever, because some of those conversations have been probably not the driver for decision making. And I worked in private healthcare for a long time, and the endless debate about mission versus margin was something I certainly got bored of. But again, it's this idea of why is it a binary? We need to have conversations that are actually intelligent of all of those different needs of our communities to continue to get the services close to where they live, work and play. And if you don't have community managed organisations, I would argue that it will be very hard for community members to access them. So it's this kind of balancing act, which, you know, again, to accounting peers that I've had on boards or treasurers that I've worked with, has always been one of the key functions. It's also one of the hardest executive roles to recruit to. So you're at a premium. And, you know, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for the ones that have routinely been elected onto boards that I've reported to.
And before we go to the next question, I just wanted to let everyone know too that we are going to have a quick poll to find out where people fit into the sector or how they fit into the sector. So please go to the next question, but that's just come up on your screen now.
Thank you, David. So we have one question in our chat box. Are you aware of any benchmarking tools, networks we can bring to the boardroom to assist benchmarking based on size, complexity of the funder, and to assist with the governance maturity? Mel, I think this one will be for you.
Hogging the spotlight here, guys. So I was giving my other co-panelists an opportunity to respond. I think with regards to the benchmarking, it really depends what industry you're in, and also, do you know if there are any comparable entities? So I'll give the example, you know, with CODA, we really were looking at a lot of entities to compare ourselves to. And it was interesting, we were born of NERA, so the organisation that actually we were spun out of, but we were very different in terms of complexity and mission. So while we were similarly set up in a commercial construct, the vision, mission and purpose that we were pursuing in the decommissioning industry was also very different. So while we took bits and pieces, and I mean, Francis, perhaps if you could expand on that, you know, we took bits and pieces from organizations overseas. There really were very few, you know, direct like-for-like organizations that we could benchmark against.
Sorry, Mel. Yes, I was trying to find the little button at the bottom of the screen to turn the microphone back on. Yeah, it is very challenging. It's really hard to find a segment for many organizations in the NFP space. It's hard to find a segment that really is representative of what you are. In some ways, that's maybe a good thing, because it means that each organization is specific to its own mission. But the challenge there, of course, is then, well, how do you benchmark what you're doing against someone else from a financial, from a governance structure, and so forth. We took very much, and Mel and I have spent so much time pushing this one backwards and forwards, or maybe a bit of a tug of war from time to time. We spent initially and now spend a lot of time making sure that what we do is to scale, that what we do is minimal, for want of a better term, minimal viable bureaucracy. Make sure that we are fully compliant, but that we're not overly gilding things in that space as well, that we do where as much as possible we make sure that we've got systems that are robust and will give us all that we need for the size of organisation that we are, without spending any more time or any more money or any more of our very meagre human resources in terms of executing anything beyond that. And that's challenging. You know, it really is challenging. So to then say, well, how do we compare with the organisation next door or the organisation that my neighbour is also on the board of is a super difficult thing to do. To me, you've really got to look very hard at what your obligations are, and then find the most efficient way possible to ensure that you comply with those obligations, and sometimes go a little bit beyond them just to make sure that you've got the extra bit of protection.
Peta, I was just thinking about the board review that we did.
Yeah, so that was a 360 process, which again, you know, followed a very typical 360 profile in terms of scaling questions across 4 different domains, and was anonymized, but just like other 360s, it's quite easy to pick who's providing commentary. So I think that was a very sound process, because again, one of the key working relationships that was considered was the functional relationship between the CEO and the chair. And again, that was really interesting at that point in time, to see that particular relationship as defined by others. So I think it's a good tool, and it's one of, as I said, alongside the annual kind of retreat process, I think it's a really substantial way. I think with a lot of this, the benchmarking, that is benchmarked against like-sized organisations, and that's the only one that I know of. The other thing that is relevant, though, is accreditation. So that's not something that the board are directly involved with. Well, they are, because they're interviewed by auditors. So in our instance, we're having an accreditation next week against the National Standards for Mental Health Services, which we're required under funding by the Mental Health Commission. And the beginning of the process is 3 of the board members are going to be interviewed by the auditor. And at each point in the 3 days that she'll be on site, there is governance conversations with different touch points. So, and that is a like-to-like review. Now, it's not how it would be. It's not a comparison from a high-level governance, because the governance is in relation to the standards that are we're being accredited against. But again, it speaks to the fact that you can't have quality funded community services. We've got all the ACNC and all the other structures, but then we have the funding bodies that are saying to us, we need to look at the standards, we need to benchmark you against other potential services that could be receiving the funding. And again, the whole point of this is to guarantee quality and safe services for clients and community. And, you know, I just point to the fact that we've had ample evidence, Royal Commissions into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, Royal Commission into disability, Royal Commission into aged care. We've had a lot of examples at a national landscape recently in this country, and I'm sure there'll be more, that have highlighted the failure of institutions, whether government or community, to provide safe care. So the standards, accreditation standards and benchmarking are, for me, always within that broader governance requirement around safe practice. And this is, again, the increasingly complicated space that boards are dealing with, because not only are funders wanting that, but our client communities are also becoming more capable of pushing back and asking us what our governance looks like. We've got very informed community members.
Thank you, Peta. It was a really insightful answer. We have a really great discussion going in our chat. So one of the questions from the chat is, how are boards handling the ability to recruit or retain competent staff, given the financial resources of NFPs, when competing against the current wage increases environment and low unemployment setting? Is it at times hard to keep pace with remuneration review reports or salary bands, which quite often compete against much better resourced entities? I think Francis touched up on that. So if you want to continue.
For sure. Yeah, this has been fun and games for Mel and I right from the start, pretty much. It's challenging that you're trying to attract people in what is an incredibly tight employment market across Australia. Here in Western Australia is scarily tight in terms of opportunities for people. So what we've resorted to, no, that's not the right way to describe it. What we've landed on is an approach whereby we aim as best as we can to pay what we believe is a fair salary, but also to offer people the opportunity to be part of doing something which plays very much to their personal beliefs and their views as well. The balance there, though, can be incredibly hard to maintain. It's hard to make sure that you've got the funding to pay for the salaries for the people that you want and to keep the people that you want. It's also can be challenging to make sure that the people feel that they're engaged in getting the opportunities, the developmental opportunities sometimes. And sometimes, sadly, you've just got to accept that people will spend some time with you and then they'll move on to something else. And I think part of the opportunity there, or part of the challenge there, is to make sure that your organisation continues to be seen as an attractive place where people want to come and maybe spend some of their careers, not necessarily all of their careers. We've been very fortunate in terms of the staff that we've got. They are here, I believe, certainly because they're being paid to be here, but they're also here because they really do. Our mission very much resonates with their personal beliefs as well. And I think it's sometimes it's sometimes easy to overlook that for some people they will choose a slightly lower paid position because of the mission of the organisation, because it really does fit with where they want to be or how they want to spend their time. And for other people, it's just about the money. And sadly for the organisations, those are the people that either won't come to you at all or won't stick around when they join. So it's a super question. I wish I had the answer to it. I've got an answer, but not the answer.
No, if I could just add to that as well, Francis, I think, like going forward now, we've really focused in all the organisations I'm associated with is on culture. So what do we offer? Flexible working practices, part-time opportunities. Like really you choose, you're a professional, decide where you work from, really outcome focused. And, when looking at developmental opportunities, really, being able to broaden yourself, offering training programs, all the opportunities to do life differently, or so to say. But then, like for example, CODA, the sustainability aspect as well. We're doing something for the good of humanity. Like it seems like it's quite a close link. It's just, I don't know if our colleagues would appreciate that as much, but like it's just something to change the world. And there are people who are interested in following that values-based approach now, as opposed to, purely the dollars and cents only.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Peta, did you have anything to add to that? No. We have another question coming from our viewer. Why don't more not-for-profit organizations working in the same area of interest merge on a national level or merge similar interests? I have seen it happen in sport associations. It saves time, money, and frustration. Peta, do you want to reply to that one?
Well, I think choice is good, and mergers not always by default. Or sometimes they diminish choice, and this is a question that gets put fairly frequently to particularly small not-for-profits. I've been working in this space, and I've worked in in public and not-for-profit as well, but close to 35 years now. And the push, it's like the tide that goes in and goes out. There are periods of time when place-based organisations, so community-based organisations that are relatively small, which is what you'll be describing as a small kind of sports club, could become part of a larger federation because the emphasis is on scale and size, and funding is definitely that way. And some of the governance push and the workforce pushes that we've been talking about also tend to aggregate for large organisations. But as I said, I choose to be in a small not-for-profit because I have worked in primary care for a long time, and I know that right place, right time is usually proximal to where people live, and that communities, particularly since COVID, also appreciate small organisations, whether they're Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, gender-specific organisations, multicultural organisations. There is an absolute need in community for not all the hubs where everyone has a different door, but there's the idea that you've got economies of scale because you're simply in the same building, but the services aren't bespoke to the community members that are actually requiring them. And I think, again, at a statewide level, some of the conversation that's happening around family and domestic violence at the moment, and the chronic lack of funding for trauma services, for services for women and children, regional communities in particular, are saying to me, having the long view, that we've underfunded, we're grossly underfunded in the sector across the board, but also the push towards mergers. And certainly I've had lots of merger conversations. More mergers fail in not-for-profit, just like corporate, than succeed. But the push to mergers in large organisations are taking away client and consumer and community choice and control, and that there'll always be a place for small services, simply because, as I said, they're proximal to the need, and that's really important for people to have choice. Again, I reflect back to the Royal Commission findings. Choice is power.
If I could just support that, Peta, very quickly. I was speaking to a colleague who they were in the process of actually moving from an incorporated association in WA to actually being a Australia-wide, a national organisation. And that was exactly the fear that she actually was the biggest concern, was the lack of focus on the needs of the WA community. And it was very, very specific in the health area for chronic illness. And that small community, being able to know who your, board of management is, who you go and speak to. There are cases where I definitely think it can work, from a sporting organisation. It's pretty much click and clack, what you're going to do in WA be very similar across Australia. But yeah, I do think it's very important that the area is considered and also the needs of the community.
Thank you so much, Mel. Fortunately, that's all we have time for today. So I'll give it back to David to wrap up.
Thank you, Elena, and thanks very much for taking on the role of MC for the Q&A session. Thank you to Mel, Francis and Peta for fantastic input. I'm sure the questions were certainly very well dealt with, and was very interesting to hear the responses and the very varied nature of some of those responses as well. Thank you to Cassie and Michelle from Chartered Accountants for their work in helping to pull together this session. Please respond to the poll that we have in front of you, and all the very best for coming week, and look forward to catching up with you at the next session. Cheers.